All right, welcome to our open faith discussion at Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure today. And I have Marty and Dave with me to discuss something that we started discussing at the tail end of our conversation last week. We were talking about President Nelson and his story last week, the story that seems near and dear to him about his airplane adventure, I should say. And near the end of that conversation, we got onto a discussion about whether or not the apostles and prophets have a special witness of Christ, meaning that they've seen Jesus and talked to God, and also whether he appears to them in their group meetings and guides personally the church, and whether lay people in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believe that that's what a prophet and a special witness of Christ means and not. And I remember there was some evidence brought forward that maybe many of them haven't seen Jesus or God. And so the idea to me in my mind was maybe it's better to go forward with an assumption that they haven't unless they say they have. And then Marty, you came up near the end of the whole discussion there with a question. Why don't you ask that question again? And we'll start there.
Okay, so what is what is a prophet? What's the benefit of having a prophet if they are just regular people, I guess, was kind of what I was getting at. Or
sure, and that connects both with if they haven't seen Jesus and God, and if we're kind of giving them a pass that they don't always 100% need to tell the truth, then what are we doing here, right? Why? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say that. I would say he's like President Nelson. From our discussion last week, I don't think he was lying, but he was possibly having human error that we all have. But there are a certain set of people that are thinking that he's not making those errors because they believe that he's at a higher caliber, I guess, than average. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. So I like that nuance. So, not that. And I wasn't suggesting that it's okay for them to lie. Yeah. But we're saying that it's okay if they make mistakes, right? And
they're human.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of what is a prophet? I think I've shared some of my thoughts about this on this channel, but I want to jump in because I've been thinking about it this week by opening up I have I think a different understanding and view of what a prophet is than many lay people. Let's start with, for just a second, what does everybody here think that a regular Latter-day Saint thinks a prophet is? And I would suspect that most Latter-day Saints do think it's someone like we've kind of described here, this idea that prophets talk regularly with God, that Jesus Christ appears to them, tells them what to do, gives them revelations, and follow the prophet because he knows the way because he's talking to God. Is that an accurate guess as well?
I can tell you how I used to believe. I can't speak for, it's hard generalizing, right? Like we were talking about the Church of One. It's just really hard to generalize, but I can tell you how I did believe. I would describe it as maybe God, they don't even have to be talking to Christ, but that God is guiding them, whether through their intuitions or through the Spirit, and is guiding them and directing them to tell the membership what God wants them to hear. And I understand that it's not perfect, and I'm trying to remember how I dealt with it. I think I really just didn't think about it a lot. I don't know. But I really do believe that it's not too obscure to think that God is guiding people through a naturalistic way. And that's kind of how I thought of it. But at the same time, I did have to be obedient, or at least have to get my will aligned with the prophet's will, because the prophets, maybe that's a good way to put it, the prophet's will is closer aligned to God's than mine. So therefore, it'd be safe to align my will with the prophets so that it was closer to God. I did believe that. That would be a fair way to say that I believed. Not that he couldn't make a mistake, but that it would be rare. It would be it would be wise to follow the prophet, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so how do you feel that view of how a prophet communicates with God and how his will and his opinions and thoughts on things are closer aligned to God's, how has that changed with, as in, how did our discussion last week affect that kind of a view where we were saying and believing, okay, maybe most of these men haven't seen God or talked to Jesus. They're getting inspiration or guidance perhaps in another way. Like, does that affect that kind of a belief?
So yeah, a little bit. And I think I could have made it okay, but it is a little bit problematic because for example, when we talked a couple of weeks ago, and I brought up how Elder Packer had a talk where it was a big deal for me. And you were saying that, you can read some things that you don't necessarily agree with, and you go, well, why did he say that? Right. And I wasn't able to do that. And I would think that maybe I was misunderstanding something. Like, I need to do some work on me to try to get to a place where I do agree with what they say. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And
no,
so
I mean,
as far as the story from 2 weeks ago or last week, just learning how it's possible that President Nelson exaggerated the story, just like we all exaggerate stories. I guess that just kind of shows more of the humanness, and that maybe God is not directing him in a greater way than anybody is, if that makes sense.
Sure. Dave. Oh, you're muted, Dave. Here. I muted you on my side at one point. Sorry.
Could you hear me before?
No, now you're on. I did the muting on my side because there was some sound earlier from your side. So,
okay.
Anyway, go ahead.
Sorry about that. Well, wait, can you hear me now? Okay. I know what the problem is. I know what the problem is. Sorry.
Hey, Corey's joining us. Great.
Now, can you hear me?
Corey. Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, I have a separate microphone here, which showed that it was muted, but it wasn't getting audio from my microphone. So that's why I was talking earlier freely. Sorry about that. I thought it was muted. Anyway, what I would say about all this is that, first of all, church members often refer to there being a prophet, the prophet. There is no office that is the prophet in the church. There are 15 men which ordained as and sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators. That's a tripartite, I guess, title, right, for each of these 15 men. And they each, as my understanding, hold all the keys of the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood. And I guess we could parse what it means to be a prophet as opposed to a seer, as opposed to a revelator. But that's the title that they all have: prophet, seer, and revelator. What I guess my reaction to what we've been saying is, maybe, and this is just pure speculation, but maybe a prophet, seer, and revelator receives revelation in no different way than anybody else. But the subject of the revelation that they are allowed to receive is for the stewardship of the entire world or the entire church. That's all, right? And so when I think about the ways that I have felt guided by revelation, by the Spirit in my life, it's nothing too, I guess you would say, theatrical. It's been ways where I've felt that something is right or beneficial, or that I should do something, but it's a feeling. And it's, I guess, for those who think that there's something very foreign about this, there's not. It's similar to what you would expect any kind of intuition or intuitive feeling, which is not necessarily based on reason or rationality or a, pros and cons intellectual approach to decision making. Whenever you step outside that purely intellectual, purely rational, and you make a decision, you're doing it based on something, I guess, that we could call some X factor called intuition. And I think that most LDS people seem to conflate those two concepts a bit, in that intuitive kind of guidance that we all have. LDS people are more inclined to choose to view that as guidance of the Spirit. And I'm not saying that it is or isn't external right now. I'm just saying that I think that those are very similar concepts for those who are not LDS, thinking, well, what is this revelation that you're talking about? I think it's just intuitive decision making, or what you would think of as intuitive decision making. However, I choose to believe that that intuition comes from God in some cases. And because I choose to believe that, I label that as revelation. Now,
we had a conversation several weeks or months ago about how seeing some amazing things in your life, choosing to believe them as miracles, changes your view on things. Anyway, keep going.
Sure. And so if you are a believer, you would choose to view certain things in your life as divine or divinely inspired, or manifestations of divinity or intersections with divinity. You choose to see that you're not compelled to. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt, but you can choose to do that. Now, if that's how I'm defining revelation in my own life, it's not difficult for me to think that within the concept that LDS people often refer to as stewardship, right? One's responsibility within the church, within the kingdom of God. My stewardship includes myself, my family. If I have a special calling to minister to a family or a person, they're within my stewardship. They're my responsibility in a sense. And so because of that, and whatever calling I have in the church, whether it's working in the primary or working in the young men's organization or whatever, or being a bishop or whatever, that becomes then my stewardship for the duration of that calling. While that is my stewardship, I believe I'm entitled to receive this kind of intuitive guidance, this revelation, which I choose to believe comes from God, as part of that stewardship. When my callings get quote unquote bigger or more, have a more direct effect on a larger number of people, like a calling like a bishop or a stake president, or more visible, I don't think there's anything that changes about the way that I would receive revelation if I were to have one of those callings. I don't think that suddenly, bam, you're a bishop and you start hearing an audible voice where you didn't before. I think that the language of revelation is personalized to each individual, and that it can, in the scriptures, it gives many examples of different kinds of revelation, whether an audible voice, a vision, dreams, but also just feelings, a still small voice, which pierced them to the center, it talks about, which is not an audible voice necessarily. So there's all these different languages of revelation, languages that people can perceive or choose to interpret what they perceive to be intuitive guidance. And I don't think that once you get a visible calling, or a calling that affects more people, that you suddenly start receiving revelation in a more, visible way, a way that would be more discernible by your five senses necessarily. It could be that you become, as you engage in more service, you become increasingly aligned with the will of the Lord, because he was and is the consummate servant to all. And so as you engage in that service, serving your fellow men, the people that live around you, your will may become more aligned with his. And so you may become more sensitive to those kinds of intuitive promptings.
I want to expand just a little further, even the idea that that when you have the calling or the stewardship, that you may receive more revelation with regard to that calling or stewardship, in that it doesn't have to be just a church thing. And I know you didn't say that, but it doesn't have to be just a church calling or stewardship, but in your occupation. Sure. I think as you approach the Lord in whatever occupation you hold, you are kind of entitled to that guidance, direction, intuition, and the feelings and protection of the Holy Spirit in those areas. And so if you are, say, the leader of a company, CEO, president of a company, you may get some inspiration in that regard. The president or excuse me, the governor of a state, or even the president of a country, or the king. And so we read about this kind of revelation coming to kings in the Old Testament, and to Pharaoh, when Pharaoh
Pagan
received
kings.
a dream.
Yeah.
Well,
I
yeah,
said
and
pagan kings that didn't believe in the the God of
exactly.
Abraham. Right.
Right there in the scripture, revelation comes to Pharaoh and to pagan kings about what God is going to do in their country. And in my opinion, just to align with what you said, each person has kind of that right to channel the revelation from God about their responsibility and stewardship, whether in the church or outside of the church. That's and so when we eventually meet God in the hereafter and sit down, part of how I envision it is God sits down with Pharaoh and says, hey, so you called yourself Pharaoh of all Egypt, and you oversaw all Egypt. How'd you do with that? And when he sits down with the president of the United States, he'll say, so you were the president of the United States. How'd you do with that? And when he sits down with someone who was the prophet, seer, and revelator and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he will say, hey, so you were the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. How'd you do with that? And in I guess what I'm saying is that, like you said, it seems to me that with each responsibility that you have that right to that additional guidance and intuition. And like you said, it probably won't change much from what it was before you had that responsibility. As an example of that, I think of when I went on my mission, there was likely some additional guidance, additional inspiration, additional revelation that I was able to receive about the people that I was working with and teaching, but I didn't personally feel any different. And I'm not sure that the revelation came in a different way. It may have been more apparent to me because I was more focused on it.
I think that's it. I think that when we talk about, well, what kind of revelation are the prophets, seers, and revelators in the church receiving? What I'm suggesting is, and I appreciate everybody coming to my TED Talk today while I think about this out loud, but what I'm suggesting is that it's only different. It's only different from my own revelatory experiences in two ways. One, in scope, because of their stewardship, and two, in their own sensitivity toward receiving and interpreting that revelation.
Do you think that that's different than what most Latter-day Saints consider to be?
I think if I were to present that to most Latter-day Saints, I think they'd probably say, yeah, that sounds right. But I don't think that they've probably thought through it necessarily in that way. And so I think that offhand, yeah, I think it's a very common belief within the church that the 15 prophets, seers, and revelators of the church are routinely receiving what we would probably term as extraordinary revelatory experiences, whether viewing visions, hearing voices, etc. So I don't know that they are or that they're not, and certainly I don't want this to come across as any kind of limitation on that belief. It may be that they are, and I'm completely wrong about this. I just don't see in my own movement between different callings in the church, my revelatory experiences have varied in those two ways: the scope and my own sensitivity. They've never varied in that, oh, now I've got an important calling, so now I'm suddenly seeing things. It doesn't happen, and I don't know why it would the further up the chain that you go. And so I believe that there have been prophets that have seen God in Jesus Christ? Of course I do. That's one of the fundamental beliefs in our church. Do I believe that there have been people that are not called as prophets, seers, and revelators who have seen visions with their physical or spiritual eyes? Yes, I also believe that. Have I? No, I have not. Would it surprise me to learn that some or even all of the 15 prophets, seers, and revelators right now in the church have not seen a vision? Wouldn't surprise me. And it wouldn't shake my faith in any way. I've talked long enough. Let's hear from Marty and Corey.
Marty, you were going to say something right there. Jump in.
Well, there's a couple of thoughts. I hope I remember both of them. So I guess I do wonder. So, okay, this is what I was going to say. What you were saying, Dave, is very much what I started to believe when I was in my first presidency. And I was in a primary presidency, and we would pray to find out who should fill certain callings.
You were in the first presidency?
It was weird because
her first.
Did I say that?
Oh, your first presidency. Okay.
My first, yeah. so yeah, like I was, we were trying to fill callings and we all prayed about it. We got some names and we all got some similar names and we're like, oh, okay, this is the guidance of God. And we give those to the bishop, and then the bishop never used names. And so I thought that was weird. I was like, and he probably knew things that we didn't or whatever. I don't know.
But
Or maybe
just
they'd
to be
already
clear,
been
that
asked and they'd already said no. Who knows?
and that doesn't mean you didn't
What?
receive revelation. Yeah.
No, I understand that. But I guess as I saw the workings of ward leadership and how a lot of it is and you still pray about it and you hope that you are receiving guidance. But what I learned is that like this is probably I guess I started to understand this is probably how it works all the way up. There isn't you know what I mean? Like the bishop is doing their best as a person to do these things. Like there's probably, and you hear a few stories here and then like just miraculous calling stories or something, right? And people faith promoting stories
Sure.
that some are probably embellished, you know, kind of like we were talking about last week. But I guess my question and where I kind of started to struggle with my personal faith is I'm not sure my intuition and God guiding spirit, I couldn't tell the difference between the two. And obviously our intuition can be wrong. I think we could all agree on that. Like our intuition is based on our experience, which is limited. And so I started, and now from my perspective on the outside, I find a lot of wisdom outside of the church where there are a lot more experiences, whereas like the leadership in the church, I feel like is in a church focused thing. And so they're not getting the experiences outside the church. So I feel like there is wisdom outside the church that is needed by people. You can't get everything from the 15, I guess. So
Absolutely. And I know
Anyway,
that both
that's-
Corey and Stephen have a comment that they want to make. I'm just going to say something real quick, just because I need to tweak something I said earlier. I talked quite a bit about, or I drew an analogy between revelation and intuition. I wasn't saying revelation is intuition. And I know that you all understand this, but what I was saying is that the sensation of revelation in my own life, the closest thing I could compare it to, or what I attribute to being revelation, the closest thing I can compare it to is intuition. So that's all I was saying. It was just trying to draw a bridge
me
to
too.
something that
I was just wondering.
Go ahead.
Sure.
I'm done.
Okay. Corey, do you want to jump
I'll
in
let
here?
you guys go ahead and do your thoughts. My only comment is just I wonder if you can tell the difference between the two. That's where my faith kind of fell apart, is that I started to doubt the level of certainty I should give to something I thought was the spirit when it could just be my intuition.
Yeah, and
I couldn't
surely
tell the
as
difference
we've
personally.
shown,
So that's where
as we've shown a willingness to give prophets, seers, and revelators a pass sometimes, or to say, yeah, I'm not sure that I agree. You know, we're kind of doing the same kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? But saying, yeah, was this just the prophet's intuition and opinion, or was this actual revelation and inspiration? And it is, we all kind of have those questions sometimes. Corey, what's your thought that you wanted to share?
Well, I'll go in reverse, I guess. So in response to that part, I mean, yeah, that's, we're all subject to self-deception and our, confirmation bias of ourselves or everything. Like, I really want to do this. I pray, and hey, lo and behold, God told me I should do the thing that I already wanted to do. Like that happens sometimes. But I don't know. I think at least and this is a question that anyone will have, because you can't ever get outside of yourself, but to discern yourself from the spirit. And there are, I don't know if it always, at least in my experience, ever has to be completely one or the other. I think they can work hand in hand, as in it is your inspiration, it's your own mind, but perhaps, what we call quickened by the spirit, or your brain is making connections that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise, and dumb little things like that. Because like it's hard to know the difference, because like I've had these dumb little experiences, and I people bring these up when you talk about the problem of evil, like, oh, like some people pray to find their keys, and they do, and they're like, God is in my life. And some people pray not to, have their kids get killed, and then they get killed. And like, so why are you so happy that your keys got found if other people are having their kids get killed? But I have had times where I've been looking for things like my keys, and I literally couldn't find them. And I tried everything. And then I said a prayer, and I don't know if it was my own mind calming down and focusing, or literally like God was helping me find my keys. I really tell the difference per se, but as far as my experiences, it's something that comes from outside of me, not just my thoughts, but it is also through my thoughts. And that's how I kind of view revelation. Is it's a tandem between the receiver of revelation and the Spirit and God. That's never, I don't know if it's ever separate, but I want to share a metaphor for what you were saying before about like how bishoprics and leadership works. I'm a graphic designer by trade, and so like it's fun because it's kind of like art and inspiration to do art is like not something that you can make yourself do per se. Like sometimes you're inspired and sometimes you're not. But with my job, it's like dance monkey, and you better like it every time, right? So it's like I have to make it look like I'm doing the inspiration, whether it's there or not. But the fact is, sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. And I know with the leadership, a lot. Like I've been in I was in Ukraine on my mission, and I was in. They have a very sparse membership in some of those areas, so the missioners had to serve in leadership capacities. And I've been on those things, and like when we're trying to pray for people to call, we're all like, I mean, we're doing it, but at least the way I felt, I'm like, I'm making my best guess. I'm praying about it, and if I don't, if something doesn't tell me otherwise, I'm going to go with my best guess, and hopefully that works out, and it might not.
Dance, Bishop Monkey, get some revelation right now.
Yeah, well, exactly. I'm trying to say, like, so you got to. The problem is you have to move forward in leadership, whether you have great revelation or not, and you're like, hey, I could use it, but it's there. But I have had experiences where I have felt that there is clear guidance on things. At least I felt there was, but it's not always 100% there. But like, it could go in.
It's fascinating because in connection with that, I've got to move forward whether I'm getting the revelation or not. I think immediately of, have you all seen the ancient now movie, The 10 Commandments, with Charlton Heston as Moses, and he's on Sinai and he's, waiting for revelation from God, and he's marching around. There's just a moment. This is a very obscure moment in the video when he kind of pounds against the wall of the thing, like, where are you? I saw you in a burning bush. Talk to me. He's been on the mountain fasting for 40 days and nothing from God, and that's not the only time that happened in Moses's life, where he was waiting for and looking for direction and didn't get it. And Joseph had the same issue, right? Oh God, where art thou? And where is the pavilion that covers your hiding place? Is the opening of one of the greatest revelations, him saying, I have been locked up in this prison, praying for you to reveal something to me and to come to me for days and days and nothing. And I think that these prophets and all of us have to just move forward at times without the revelation that we really hope we would receive right then. And, who knows exactly why.
And parents.
Yeah, exactly. Parents and bishops and teachers and just everybody and presidents of the country, and wishing that someone would tell us what to do, and we don't get it. But then occasionally we do. And it can be a weird, why does God choose to give us revelation here and there? But anyway, the point is that you got to assume, because it's written right there in the scriptures, that sometimes the prophets are moving forward without specific revelation. Because they just have to. They've got to make a decision, and it's not coming. I wanted to share something, again, that forms the basis for my understanding of what a prophet is. It's not specifically this quote from Joseph Smith, but it reflects what I believe about prophets. It's a quote from Joseph Smith in Teachings of the Presidents of the Church, Joseph Smith, the book that the church has published. And it's in chapter 33, the spiritual gifts of healing, tongues, prophecy, and discerning of spirits. And let me jump now to this screen, because all I did was I Googled Joseph Smith on the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And this pops up because that's the phrase that comes to me all the time is this quote here from Joseph Smith that I'm about to read. I want to point out that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that published this book titled the top of this section right here, though only one man speaks as the prophet of the church, the spirit of prophecy enables all to testify of Jesus Christ. And the funny thing is that the quote only says the second half. The spirit of prophecy enables all to testify of Jesus Christ. The church decides they want to be very careful that even though Joseph right here is saying anyone with the spirit of prophecy, anyone who testifies of Christ is a prophet. That's what they actually say right here. But the church wants to be very clear and say, but don't get any funny notions in your head. There's only one prophet. I think it's kind of funny, but let's.
Well, I mean, in fairness, that it's important that they draw a distinction between, capital P prophet and lowercase p, because the scriptures are full of references to the spirit of prophecy and to prophets. And so if we didn't know the difference, it would be a very confusing book indeed,
and
more confusing than it already is.
You say capital P prophet, and the interesting thing is I wish they would split up the definition and teach it the way that I've come to understand it. And that is, I think it's the president of the church that we're talking about when we say there's only one. There's one president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that president presides, has the, as we've been talking about in this chat, the stewardship to make those decisions for the whole church. Whereas there may be millions of prophets or people with a testimony of Christ in the spirit of prophecy who receive revelation. Let's jump into this quote here, but there's only one who is enabled or who has the authority to guide the church or to declare what will be taught over the pulpit and so on and so forth. We'll come back to that in a second. Let me read this quote here. So Joseph says, no man or a woman or person, whatever, but is a minister of Jesus Christ without being a prophet. There's a capital P on that. No man can be a minister of Jesus Christ except he or she has the testimony of Jesus. And this is the spirit of prophecy. John the Revelator says that the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Now, if any man has the testimony of Jesus, has he not the spirit of prophecy? And if he has the spirit of prophecy, I ask, is he not a prophet?
Lowercase p.
A prophet. What?
Lowercase p. I'm just saying, however it's written here, I don't think is necessarily definitive in terms of uppercase and lowercase.
I know.
That was just a shorthand I was using.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I ask, is he not a prophet? And if I'm trying to redefine prophet, since the question that Marty's proposed is generally, so what is a prophet, right? And I'm trying to go back to the definition of prophet that Joseph actually gave. When people would say, are you a prophet? This is the answer he would give. And so as opposed to, like, if we were to go, we talked about this last week, if we were to go to the brethren, the prophets, seers, and revelators and say, what makes you a special witness? Have you seen God? They equivocate a little bit, is what we have experienced when we've seen someone ask them that question. And this was the equivocation that Joseph gave when asked, are you a prophet? He would give this specific quote that I'm reading to you. So let's keep going here real quick. If that person has the spirit of prophecy, I ask, is he not a prophet? And if a prophet, will he not receive revelation? And any man or woman that does not receive revelation for himself or herself must be damned. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And essentially, you need to have the testimony of Jesus to be saved. For Christ says, ask and you shall receive. And if he or she happens to receive anything, I ask, will it not be a revelation? And if any man or woman has not the testimony of Jesus or the Spirit of God, he or she is none of his, namely Christ. And if not his, he or she must be damned. And you can read on because he says it again. He says it a couple different times in different ways. And the idea, again, is that if you have received a knowledge that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, which knowledge and the Savior of the world, which knowledge is required for salvation. Faith and belief in Jesus is required for salvation. And if you have received that testimony, as Simon did when Jesus said, Simon, whom say ye that I am? And he says, thou art the Christ, the Son of God. And he says, blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it to you, but my Father, which is in heaven. What he was saying is, the only way to get that witness that I'm the Son of God and the Savior is a revelation. And apparently the Holy Ghost has revealed that to your heart. So for all of you out there who have received a spiritual witness or revelation in your heart that Jesus Christ is the Savior, you have received revelation, and that makes you a prophet. And so that's one definition of a prophet. And what is the role of a prophet from that point? In my opinion, when Moses went out and saw the burning bush and received his revelation and witness that God exists and that God called him, what God called him to do was to go and get the rest of the children of Israel, bring them out of the world into the wilderness to Mount Sinai, where they too could have the same spiritual witness. They were invited to come and see the burning bush themselves and get the same witness. And when Joseph, we talked about this last week a little bit, when Joseph first prayed in the sacred grove and saw God, it was on the first tellings of the story, more of a personal experience for him, just his own personal little revelation that God exists and I'm not to join any of the other churches and God is mindful of me and he hears my prayers. That was kind of what it was for him at that moment, until he realized that he was to go and get the rest of the children of Israel and bring them out of the world and create groves, sacred groves for them, or temples, places where they too could go and worship and get the same kind of witness and revelation that he had had. And so I argue then that a prophet is someone who has received revelation and a testimony of Jesus, and whose role, and that would be any of us who have received that. And then from that point, our role is to invite others to do the same, to just point others in the same direction and say, you go get your witness of Christ too. Go read the words of other prophets who are testifying of him and pray about it. Go to the temple, go to your sacred grove, climb a mountain, whatever, go talk to God, because that's, in my opinion, the role of a prophet. And that's all that prophets do. When we talk about some of these other things like leading a church, again, I think that's the role of the president, just like leading the young women is the role of Marty's first presidency, anyway, her presidency.
That was a primary presidency.
No, primary. Sorry, forgive me. and so the point is that Marty may have been a prophet at that time, and she was the president of the primary in that organization.
Just a counselor.
Well, yeah, okay. And so that guides, what she is supposed to do in that stewardship and her role. But the word prophet, to go back to this original question of, well, if they're not regularly seeing God and being guided and directed by him, what good is a prophet, or what is a prophet? And I think throughout this conversation, we've said, well, it seems like all of us are entitled to revelation and inspiration, and in our particular capacities and stewardships. And as Dave said, the intensity of that might change, but typically the manner doesn't change all that much. And then what our inspiration and revelation refers to might change as our stewardship does. But all of the people who are receiving revelation have the spirit of prophecy, and therefore that's the role of a prophet. And so when we're looking at someone who is a prophet, who has a testimony of Jesus and receives revelation in their daily life, who happens to also be the president of the church, they have that added responsibility, and that allows them to have that spirit of prophecy with regard to the entire church. And anyway, that doesn't necessarily though mean that they're walking around talking to God all the time. It doesn't shake my belief or my understanding of what a prophet is when Joseph defines it that way and says, look, yes, I'm a prophet. A prophet is just someone with the testimony of Jesus who's received that testimony by revelation. And all of us, he says, need to be that. As Moses later said, when Joshua came running to Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. What should we do? Should we shut them down? And Moses said, would God all Israel were prophets? Meaning God wants everyone to be a prophet. He wants everyone to have that witness. So that's my 2 bits on what a prophet is. Anybody want to jump in now?
I can be short because it's pretty similar to what you've been saying. Just that's kind of the direction I've been heading to, is like, but maybe with the understanding of, the priesthood keys, because that's, I try to like understand. I'm like, okay, so we have positions in the church, because there's like the church as an organization, as opposed to like an actual, the godly side of it, where it's like the spiritual organization. And I think, however you argue it, there's kind of a bit of both, because the prophet or the first presidency is in charge of the organization itself, like literally like it's not a corporation, but like, they deal with a lot of money, and they have to hire and fire, if you will, their leadership and stuff like that. And so
There are lots of responsibilities other than just the prophet's responsibilities, right?
exactly.
There-
And most of it is probably just like bureaucratic leadership stuff that, could just imagine an organization of this size is pretty big, right? So, but they also have, like you said, I view them too as like basically a faithful member. Obviously, they're going to have been faithful their whole life. They got called, and if you think, whether that was guided by true inspiration or not, they obviously demonstrated to at least the degree of, to make it appear on the outside that they're, faithful members of this church and they're stalwart. I'm assuming they only call those kind of people to do these things, and then they get there, and I believe they're very well-intentioned and people striving to be followers of Christ, that also have been given the keys of the priesthood, if you believe in that kind of thing, that they can then exercise the same capacity, like you've been saying, for that larger area. But like I said last time with my experience with like President Nelson, it was eye-opening, because I kind of knew that even then, when I was like 19, that he hadn't maybe been seeing Jesus every day, but like hearing it, I was like, that is something that I had in the back of my mind, that like that was something that I kind of thought that maybe they were doing, and then like thinking about it, like, oh, maybe not, and then maybe prophet then is shifting to mean something else, so more akin to what we've been talking about. So that is what it is for me, and that's why it is that's why I take everything that the leadership says too with a grain of salt. And I know they have to dance this fine line between like being a leadership people and appealing to a mass base, but also being regular people and playing with the line of how much, the thing is, maybe they do believe they're being guided by God in literally every single one of their decisions that they make. And, I can't deny that or confirm it, but at the same time, I take what they say with a grain of salt, because I don't have to just take what they say for granted. On face value. I'm supposed to go get confirmation of that myself. And I know that they'd always, the church as an organization will be like, well, if you're not agreeing with the prophet, then you're probably not doing it right. But that's them. And I think the thing is, I have a relationship with God that's my own relationship, and that's what I'm concerned with. And if I'm going to be following a leader, then I'm going to base it on my experience of my spiritual confirmation of what they're doing, for better or worse. And I know the church hasn't probably been like that in the past, but I think that is kind of what they do promote, whether they want to follow through with that or not.
There's a difference between me getting my own revelation and deciding whether what I'm hearing from the prophets, seers, and revelators is right for me, versus whether I go out and get a revelation and say what they're doing is wrong for the church.
Yeah, everyone should do what I do. Yeah, no.
Yeah, I just don't have that authority or that right, because I'm not because I'm not a prophet in my own right, but because I'm not the president. I don't hold the keys. I don't have that. And so that's why I like to separate those words into the two different camps.
Two things have come to mind during these comments. One is the difficulty of being a mouthpiece, or a mouthpiece for somebody else, a messenger for somebody else, right? That's a difficult thing, especially if you stand in loco, I guess in the place of that principle, and the rest of the people don't see the principle, right? At least on a regular basis. So I guess the analogy here is like, a head coach to a football team who's calling the plays to his quarterback, who then runs in and calls the plays to the team, right? And then lo and behold, the head coach is not there during one play. He has chosen to be gone, or has turned off his headset or something. And I don't know why. And it's not really my place to ask him why. But let's say he's not there, or he's not calling a play.
Or simply he's decided that he wants the quarterback to do it by himself.
Could be. And so the quarterback's looking over there going, where'd he go? Where'd he go? And everybody's going, what's the play? What's the play? And he's going, well, this is the play. And he makes a call. And there's the team gets sacked and there's a loss of yardage. And people are going, man, I thought we had this infallible coach. And I said, well, yeah, we do. But he doesn't call every single play. He calls some plays. And so there's a difficulty there. I mean, it's a horrible analogy, but I think that there's a difficulty in being a mouthpiece for a God who's not constantly telling you everything to say.
In fact, that's the point of a mouthpiece, isn't it? Right? What's the point of a mouthpiece if it doesn't speak, when the other person's not around? I mean,
no, the point of the mouthpiece is to convey the messages of the principle.
Because the principle's not present to convey them themselves.
The principle gives the mouthpiece the message. The mouthpiece conveys the message, but then everybody else goes, tell us more. And he goes, well, consistent with this message, I think X, Y, Z. And they go, oh, those are the words of the principle of the God. And he goes, well,
yeah, maybe.
Yes, in a way, but the principle is giving the mouthpiece messages as the principal chooses. That's the principal's prerogative. And so it's difficult when the recipients hold the mouthpiece to the standard of, asking follow-up questions, tell us more, whatever. And we have general conferences every 6 months at which maybe the principal has revealed something new and maybe he hasn't. So that was the first observation, is just the difficulty of being a mouthpiece with a principal who you can't, make demands of. The second is Joseph Smith was a different kind of prophet, seer, and revelator, I think, than the other modern prophet, seers, and revelators that we've had. And he set a mold that has given the wrong impression, I think, to all subsequent generations of prophets and their followers. Because Joseph Smith was apparently receiving revelations down to the sentence level, I don't know, but down to the word level on a regular basis. That's the belief of, I think, most members of the church. Now, to how he was receiving the revelations that are recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants, how he translated the Book of Mormon, I don't know all the answers to these questions, but there was something that was at a different, it was revelation of a different kind than I'm used to. I'll say that. It was revelation at a different scale and in a different frequency than I could imagine. And so I think we've attributed that kind and level of revelation to all subsequent prophets and said, oh, they're all receiving basically daily, revelations, which they write down verbatim from God's mouth. And I just don't think that that's happening. I don't even think Brigham Young, I think Brigham Young immediately after Joseph's death was going, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say.
He said to himself, I think
all the people that sustained him as prophet said, where's your revelations? And that must have been very difficult, because I think that was a Joseph Smith thing. And it was because Joseph had a very specific role.
The quote is attributed to Brigham Young as saying that he said, I'm a Yankee guesser. I may not be the same kind of prophet and leader as Joseph was, but I'm a Yankee guesser. And I don't know how true that is, but that's to the point. And I want to say something else about Joseph and how he was setting up the church for revelatory guidance.
Well, he was. I just wanted to say one more thing, is that he was likened throughout Scripture, that LDS people consider Scripture, to being like unto Moses. Again, a different kind of prophet. If you look at Moses's role versus anybody else in the New or in the Old Testament, a different kind of prophet. And Joseph Smith was a different kind of prophet also. So I think that is the source of some of the confusion. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, well, and I'm getting sidetracked just a little bit. Joseph was clearly the classic definition too of a seer, in that he used divining rods and seer stones and other kinds of seer instruments that, as you read the Old Testament and you study what is a seer and what did they use and their roles, and the Urim and Thummim and that kind of stuff, those tools were all attributed to use with seers. And we just haven't heard of any Latter-day prophets after Joseph Smith picking up the seer stones, the divining rods, the Urim and Thummim, and using them. We call our modern apostles prophets, seers, and revelators, and yet, as Dave was just saying, Joseph was evidently different than the rest because he was clearly a seer, Joseph the seer. But I just want to also point out that Joseph received these revelations, as Dave was just talking about, wrote them all down, dictated them or whatever, put them in the Book of Commandments, later the Doctrine and Covenants, and then he would, and this, I learned this from Rough Stone Rolling, which Marty mentioned that she had read last week. And so this was something that Bushman writes in there about how Joseph would call the apostles and the quorum of the 12, together, and they would have meetings and they would take minutes and they would make decisions. And then as soon as they were done coming to a unanimous decision of the quorum, he would ask them to write down the decision and put it in, and they would take that decision and they would put it right next to his other revelations in the Book of Commandments, basically indicating that this is another way for revelation to come by the unanimous decision of the quorum. And he actually then wrote that into the Doctrine and Covenants, this idea that when the quorum of the 12 makes a unanimous decision, it is essentially the same as, well, it is revelation and guidance for the church. And when the first presidency makes a unanimous decision, and when later the quorums of the 70 are all unanimous, then we have revelation. And so it's kind of, there's this path for revelation where a seer or a prophet, president of the church, gets direct revelation from God. And then there's this other path where the unanimous presidency, the body overseeing some stewardship, makes a unanimous decision. And I actually think that that's how revelation can also work in our families, where a husband and wife make a unanimous decision. They pray, they seek guidance, and they simply make a decision themselves. Maybe they don't get a download of information and receive the inspiration, revelation that they know comes from God, but they are unanimous on a certain front. And I think that's probably revelation for the family. And then, as we were talking about earlier, the bishopric or the primary presidency gets together and they don't necessarily get vision from God, but they feel unanimous about something, and that's revelation for their stewardship. And so, that being said, again, we have this idea from Joseph Smith that revelation and the spirit of prophecy isn't always this huge, vision of God, but it is the testimony of Jesus and then the unanimous decisions of the faithful ones who've been called to that role. Corey, you.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is more like a position I'm taking now that I'm going down the path of a belief system it's called open theism, which just means that God doesn't necessarily know the future infallibly because the future doesn't exist yet. There's a lot of complicated things going to that. But with that, it's kind of like, it's changed my view from like God has a meticulous plan of every single thing that's supposed to happen, and then he guides us and we pray. Like when we're asking for revelation, that's implying that there is a right answer or there's something that should be. And then we're asking, please guide me to the thing that should be because it will work out for my best. But on this open theism view, I mean, God probably, can see the probabilities and knows what can happen and all that, but he doesn't know exactly how things are going to play out. If the primary reason is because of free will. If it's real, he can't know that for sure, because then you wouldn't have free will, because if you can know the future decisions, then anyway, that goes into it. But with the way that you were just talking with how revelation works for the church, I think it's kind of a joint thing sometimes. Like, hey, instead of like, I think God has basic things that he is going to have happen at some point in the future, like, to make the world do the things in Revelation or whatever to some point. But I think the way I've been viewing it recently is that it's kind of more of like a group exercise of like, hey, remember the reason we came down here wasn't because God had this magical plan for himself, that he had to do something with humans and mold them like clay so that he could get this magical thing for himself. No, this is like a school for us. So instead of viewing it as like a set meeting, it's more like I don't know if you've been to one of those I forget what they're called. There's a type of like school where you go and you're just like, hey, yeah, you guys, you set the agenda. Tell me what you want to learn about. what are you interested in? What is it that is important to you right now? And I'll help you. The teacher helps the kids. They get into groups and they do this, and then they help them along the way, and they learn what they want to learn. And there's some natural consequences that come in sometimes, and teach them a lesson that sometimes the teacher will help them with, and sometimes they'll like, oh, let's see what happens, and like, okay, we learned this, therefore we'll move forward. So I'm viewing kind of the way that God works with prophets and the church and each of us individually is kind of like that. Instead of saying, I have a plan for you exactly lined out, in that I have a plan for you in that I want you to grow and learn from your experiences. So let's do it together. You choose your life for you. You choose where you're going, and I will foster that and do the best I can and try to guide you. But ultimately, what you learn is up to you, because that's the purpose. God isn't guiding the church because, at least in my view, for himself. He's doing it for us and saying, we can make mistakes along the way. Like, hey, that didn't work, did it? Your policy there was crap. It alienated a lot of people. Like, oh, hey, let's include these people and do it this way. Like, hey, that works.
I think that's interesting. I get the feeling that you might be referring to the recent policy changes with as we've mentioned a few times in these videos on whether or not we allow the children of gay couples and whatever to be baptized, and how we had that. Is that what you were meaning when you said that policy? That didn't work out.
But there's other policies that, like, even the recent Saturday session thing. They're like, we're doing away with the Saturday session. Like, actually, we're not doing away with the Saturday session.
Well,
we're going to do something different.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I just wanted to touch on that briefly, and then we're going to give Marty the last word on this, because we've all been talking a whole bunch here. So I want to let Marty, you be thinking about whatever you want to say to share whatever your thoughts have been this whole time as we've been going back and forth. But what came to my mind as you were talking, Corey, and then you brought up the policy changes, was the story that the somewhat troubling story that Elder Holland tells, that we're all probably familiar with, the one where he and his son were out driving, camping, and they didn't know which direction to turn in their vehicle, and they decided to say a prayer, and they received what they thought was unmistakably clear guidance that they should go, I don't remember which direction it was, but to turn one way, and they went that way, and only a little while later, on this road, at that fork in the road where they didn't know, they just went down it a little bit farther, and they ran into a dead end, and they realized, oh, this was not the way, so they turned around and they went the other way. And again, there are reasons why this story is troubling. I know that, and I recognize that. And it's an interesting story because, of course, the son says to Elder Holland, why did we get the impression that we should go that way if that was the wrong way? And Elder Holland thinks about it for a second, and he says, well, we learned very quickly that way was not the right way, and that means that this way was the correct way at the fork in the road, and we learned it without any doubt. And if we had instead gone this way first, then we might get miles down the road, still be lost, still not know if we're going the same direction, and be questioning our decision and say, should we turn around and go back to the fork and go the other way? And what a waste of time and direction and whatever. And anyway, again, troubling idea that the prophets might do the exact same thing as prophet, seer, and revelator Elder Holland described, that sometimes they get together like the Father and Son and get some unmistakable revelation that they should take the church this way, and then a year later they go, shoot, that was the wrong direction. But now they turn it around and they're headed in an entirely different direction for the foreseeable future, because they've learned, as Corey just said, we've made this mistake and we now know that was not the right way to go. Is that possible? I'm willing to say in some things it might be just as troubling as it may be, because we are led by fallible humans who we make mistakes, and they make mistakes, and they get revelation the same way that this father and son did as they prayed in a pickup truck. Just an impression. And that's okay. They don't always see. It's okay to me that a prophet doesn't always see Jesus Christ, who appears to them and says, this is the direction the church should take. That sometimes instead they have to work it out on their own, make a unanimous decision, and it's possible that they make the wrong one. That's where I'm going to leave it. But Marty, jump in and share whatever you want, and we can wrap it up here.
Okay, I think I can tie a few things together. Going back to the player analogy that Dave made, I guess when I start seeing conflicts and problems is when the players look at the quarterback and they follow him with confidence that he is absolutely correct. It's for me the problem of my problems or issues with the overarching like what's reinforced at church isn't necessarily that it's possible that they might be fallible. I understand that. I guess what I struggle with is why then are we not taught? I think a lot of people realize, okay, Joseph Smith was a different kind of prophet than maybe our current prophet, but that's not really taught at church. Like we're taught that that's what makes our church special is that we have prophets, living prophets. So I guess ultimately I just people, and I knew there were some people that were believing that I was talking to Jesus. I would want to make it crystal clear that I was not talking to Jesus. And so I guess there's that, it feels, that's not, does that make sense? So anyway, that's,
Yeah, no, it sounds
ultimately,
like
that's
if I
kind
can
of where things come to a
just-
head for me.
just to rephrase,
And, yeah,
it's
I don't, that's about all I got.
yeah, no, just to rephrase what you said, it sounds like that the concern is, look, we can all accept and handle the kinds of things we've been talking about right here in this conversation. But this isn't the openness that seems to be discussed in the church. Instead, we get direction from the likes of John Taylor, who says, the prophet will never lead you astray. It's not in the cards. And so then we're taught, follow the prophet from a young age as a primary student. And so we have the impression that the prophets are receiving daily revelation and talking to Jesus. And so if it's actually the way we've all been talking about in this video, why is that not the open discussion in the church? And that's kind of your concern and your feeling, right? And
That's fair.
and I got to tell you, I have the same concern. I have the same frustration because, and it looks like Corey's nodding, because our testimonies, at least my testimony of how this works, and it comes from my study of what a prophet is in the scriptures. I arrive at what we've been talking about here today. And to me, I find it concerning that people arrive at a different version of a prophet that sets them up for a huge awakening and loss of their faith when they learn that it's not this other way, that a prophet, isn't talking to God daily. And it's a frustrating thing for me. I want to kind of get up and say the same thing you're saying, Marty. Come on.
Well, and that's what who was I talking to? This is a funny story. I was talking to my farrier that was shoeing my horse, and this came up, kind of. But he was just kind of saying how socially we need churches. And I honestly, I wonder if I agree. I'm kind of trying to figure that out. Like, do we need that social religion to keep people together? And that would be my steel man for why do we need a prophet? And it's to have less chaos. It's to have order and to have, like I think in Rough Stone Rolling, he actually talked about there were a lot of people starting to have all these revelations and they started to become very chaotic. And so my steel man for why you do need a prophet would be, or leadership, really don't need to call him a prophet. You could just say this is the president of the church and he has the last word. But that makes sense to me that you need to have something in common. And he kind of is the last word to say, you know what, I understand you guys all have disagreements, but this is what we have in common. So I'm going to say this. So that makes sense to me. And socially, I feel like we need that too. So I guess, yeah, so I agree with that, but I want a believable story, I guess, is what I want.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's not what we're talking about here. You get little tidbits here and there at church, maybe a comment here or there, but I don't feel like that's what's in the manuals, So
yeah,
anyways,
a little bit, but I wonder sometimes. I've always kind of wondered, like, if there's a crisis of faith that happens when someone gets called to be a prophet. I wonder, because like they get there and they're like, all right, time to go see Jesus. I'm the prophet now. And then they're like, wait a minute, I'm the same.
If they have that same opinion, exactly, it makes a little more sense to me then when, when I was younger, I used to think, how is it that some of these apostles are describing these scenarios where the prophet calls them in and says, we'd like to call you to fill the vacancy in the quorum of the 12, and they are super surprised by this? Shouldn't they have already seen God? Haven't they already talked with Jesus? Don't they know this is coming? And that's an evidence right there that they tell these kinds of stories where it catches them supposedly off guard that they've been called to the quorum. That must mean that, yeah, they're not getting that kind of revelation and seeing God saying, I'm about to call you to the quorum of the 12 apostles. And yeah, that will then, they'll then go through the rest of their leadership in the church, as Corey just says, perhaps with that same, there may be a struggle sometimes between these men and God, just like there was with Moses and Joseph saying, where are you, God? I'm the prophet. Shouldn't I be getting revelation? They're asking the same kinds of questions. And, they may not always be getting it, except in the way that they've accustomed themselves throughout their lives to receive revelation. And we all should be doing that same thing. Anyway, thank you for this conversation on what a prophet is. And we'll get together